Hello, and welcome to the Delivering Innovation podcast series from Perspectiv, in collaboration with the Centre for Creativity in Professional Practice at the Business School of City, University of London, formerly known as CAS. This podcast looks at what it takes to create value from innovation through conversations with practitioners working in a range of roles and sectors to make innovation and change happen. The aim is to share ideas that you can rely on to become more effective. I'm Ian Stromsmoe, and in this episode, Andy Wilkins and I spoke with Antony Matthews, who has been a friend of Perspectiv's for 7 or 8 years. Ant is a business improvement and operational leader with over 20 years' experience in problem solving, lean, Six Sigma, and facilitating change across a wide range of sectors, including utilities, banking, automotive, and aerospace. In this conversation, we explored the topic of delivering innovation through Ant's experience working with clients such as Lloyds Bank, Barclays, National Grid, GKN, and Unipart. We spoke about Ant's role leading collaboration for problem solving and innovation within businesses, including the roles of the facilitator, the resource group, and the client.
I always draw the client as an alien with 3 eyes.
Ant gave us a colourful metaphor for clients wanting to hand over responsibility to the change facilitator.
They're expecting that person to put on their pants on the outside of their trousers and be Superman and save the world.
And that was just the first half. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Ian.
And our guest today, Ant Matthews. Thank you very much for joining us, Ant.
No problem at all. It's my pleasure. Thanks both.
Now it's over to Andy.
Thanks, Ian. So let's go to this big question then that we'll start with and see where it takes us. What does delivering innovation, turning ideas into action mean to you, Ant?
It's a big question, and I think so. I'm going to go back to what's my role? So my role is 3 things. In any company I've worked in, I see my role as 3 things. And that's to build people's capability to solve team problems. So I build their capability to solve team problems. Part of my role is to facilitate the more complex problem solving. So the stuff that isn't tame, that we know as wicked or messy or wicked messes. So it's really going after those 4 problem types. And then thirdly, my role is about being that critical friend. Coach is sometimes another word for it, but being that critical friend and holding the mirror up from both a personal point of view, from personal development point of view for the person that I'm talking to, or for the team I'm talking to, or the department, or even the company in some instances, and sort of reflecting and holding that mirror up. And actually, this is what everyone else sees, or this is certainly what I see as some of the things that are going on in your organisation. Let's discuss. And if I link that back to what does innovation mean to me, my personal view is innovation is very difficult unless you're solving a problem. So you're innovating, you're thinking up new things to solve a problem. So if I can teach people to solve their own problems, so teach a man to fish, actually they're starting to solve their own team problems. They're starting to innovate for themselves. The bigger innovation, the stuff that's too complex from a people point of view, there's too many people involved, there's too many processes involved. So either technical or people, actually that's where I come in with sort of my big size 10s, and I help them solve those problems just by using a fair process, really. And process is probably the key word in there. So that innovation, I believe, has got to come from, in most instances, a problem to solve in the first place. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's loads of springboards from that. The first one I want to briefly explore is, when did you figure out, because you say in your role, is that always been your role, or is that something that you figured out? And it could be probably helpful to say a few words about that broader context of the role as well.
So I'll answer the second one first. So the broader sense of my role, I've been a business improvement leader and operational leader for many years now, for more years than I care to remember. Lots of different training in business improvement techniques, Lean, Six Sigma, Andy, when I first met you, with facilitative leadership and creative problem solving, and lots of stuff in between, well over 20 years. So what is my job? What do I do? I work with businesses to build their capability, yes, but typically the first reason they're bringing me in is to help them solve a problem. But what I bring with them is this big, broader armory, if you like, of other stuff, and things generally snowball from that initial problem to bigger and better things.
When did you figure that out? Obviously, you didn't get born with, and welcome to the world. Your job is going to be build capability to solve 10 problems, facilitate more complex problems, and be a coach, critical friend to people. So I'm kind of curious where it emerged from.
So articulating it in that way, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, in a particular company I was working for at the time, I was part of a pretty dynamic team that would go after some real meaty issues. And we had a really good leader at the time. She was very good at articulating certain things. And although she didn't ever articulate it in that way, actually, as a team, we got to that point where we were like, yeah, this is what we do. And I kind of started thinking about that, mulling it over. And the words, where did the words come from? It was the combination of two things colliding at the same time. So that leader, the team I was in, three things, that leader, the team I was in, and going on a training course called FLCPS, which Andy, you ran. And there was loads of bombshells going off, shall we say, in my head as I was going through that course. I was first introduced to the problem types on that course. Bearing in mind, up until this point, I spent 14, 15 years in the problem-solving space, helping teams solve problems. I've never heard it described as the 4 problem types before. So tame, wicked, messy, wicked mess. Never heard it described in that way before. And it just resonated, massively resonated. And then leading a team, probably about 6 months later, I was trying to sort of figure out, well, what's the purpose of our team? What's my purpose, first and foremost? And what's the purpose of the team? And I got down to those 3 things. What my purpose is to build people's capability to solve tame problems. My purpose is to facilitate complex problem solving. And my purpose is to be the critical friend and hold the mirror up. I could very easily turn to the team and say, actually, guys, what do you reckon to this? Do you think this is your purpose as well? And I'm like, actually, this is spot on for what we need to do as well with the organisation. They were a problem-solving team. So that was kind of where it came from, the collision of those 3 things.
The 3 aspects that you talked about, which I really like the sound of those. 2 of those, at least, are very much focused on learning. First one, build capability to solve. So that's not with you, that's with everybody in whatever organisation you're in, right? So that sounds like a learning, teaching, educating role. And number 3 is to be a coach, critical friend. Coaching is often seen as something connected to leadership, but also very much connected to learning and developing people, of course. So I know one of the things Ian and I have talked about before is when you look at business improvement or innovation, is how surprised everybody is about the amount of learning that's involved. Business, let's get on and do business improvement, right? But what's that got to do with learning? Or let's do innovation. What's that got to do with learning?
The question I had was, when you're brought into businesses, what's the sort of typical understanding of the problem space? And to Andy's point, how much does the business know that learning is associated with innovation and problem solving? Okay,
I'll go for the first question and you can rephrase the second one for me in a bit. So how well does the business articulate the problem when I'm first going into them? So typically not very well, actually. So they come in, they might say, we've got a problem with this particular process. I need you to go in and lift the lid off that process, find out what's going on, because actually there's something wrong with it. It's taking too long, people are unhappy, whatever it might be. But they'll typically go after sort of one or two things. That articulating, it isn't a great articulation of a problem. So what I generally find is that they don't really know what the problem is in the first instance. And I can't stress enough how important it is to spend more time in the problem space than what you do in the problem solving space. So you've got to understand the problem first and foremost. And a lot of the companies I work with, the first thing I generally do, first week, 2 weeks, sometimes even longer, depending on the size of the problem, is obviously I go and look at the process. I go and work with the teams. I interview the leaders and I do a task appraisal with the various leaders, but not just the leaders. I also go and ask the same questions of the people that do the process. So, and those questions are typically things like, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? What's the purpose of this? What is it in the future? What should it look like in 12 months' time, in 24 months' time, so on and so forth? And then it's, what's currently going on? What's the current reality? How dissatisfied are you? Why are you dissatisfied with it? What's the data telling us? And through all of that, you get in some instances, you get lots of factual evidence. But what you're listening out for is the non-factual stuff. So you're listening to understand what's going on behind the scenes. What's the climate like? What's the environment like? And then by default, you're talking about the culture and the leadership styles and things like that. So you start to go to places that was never the first intention. The first intention is improve this process. The reality is you can put a sticking plaster over the process, but if you don't go after the bigger issues, then that problem will keep coming back. So, like I say, being that critical friend, holding the mirror up, it's helping people to see. And typically people can only see this far in front of their face. But actually, you want them to articulate and see much further in front than that. And you're helping them to see what's the realms of possible, but also what's really going on around them. And like I say, holding that mirror up. And hopefully they're receptive to that.
It sounds like often when you're brought in, there's just a general sense that there's a problem, and your job is to help define it and get a common understanding of what the problem space is.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then I know it was a double-barreled question, but to Andy's point, do the businesses typically have an understanding of how much of a learning process problem solving is?
No, and I think that's where you've got to be careful, I believe. And some of the lessons I've learned actually and continue to learn is about scaring the business by being very, very upfront of actually, if you really want to solve this problem, these are all the different things that you're going to have to do. And you're laying out this roadmap, which is massive. It's from a personal investment point of view and a financial investment point of view. It's a lot to swallow. So I'm careful not to scare them too much, because the reality is when it's written on paper like that, it does look scary. But the actual reality when you're going through it is you don't even really realize you're learning. You don't even really realize that you're in the middle of this and you're constantly learning lessons. So there's physical training courses and things like that. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important. And you need that theory to underpin a lot of things. But learning is much more than reading a book or going on a training course. Learning is reflecting on the current situation, understanding what you might want to do next, hypothesizing what that might look like, and then having a go at it. And did your hypothesis work? If not, what are you going to do differently next time? Probably about 6 months ago, I wrote a paper that for me was a work of art. I loved it, but it didn't land. It didn't land with the business at all. So I've reflected on it, and I keep reflecting on it, and I still think about different things. But probably one of the main reasons it didn't land was because it was big and scary. It was a big reflection piece in one instance, but it also mapped out a complex journey to solve those many problems that are going on, and lots of personal investment and financial investment. So I'm learning still now that those types of things, those approaches, you need to be a little bit more Machiavellian about.
So how do you take businesses on that first step? What would be the first sort of things you would do after your initial task appraisal?
So the task appraisal is really about trying to free them from the baggage. So I purposely asked the questions in a way that isn't self-limiting. So you always ask what is it you're trying to achieve? You always ask that question first. Because if you ask the question, which is what a lot of people ask, if you ask the question, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Then they start describing everything that's wrong. And what that does, it weighs them down. And I almost have this picture of them weighed down with all these different bags and suitcases of issues, and they're struggling to pull them along, and they're naturally weighed down. So what that does then, if I ask, what's the problem you're trying to solve, I ask that question first, and then I ask the question, what is it you're trying to achieve? They'll only describe something that's quite close to them, that's an easier target, that's an easier goal to achieve, because they're weighed down. Whereas if you ask the question first, they'll typically shoot for the moon. Okay, this is what I really want to achieve. And then there's stepping stones to achieve that. That's kind of the task appraisal side of things. It's really important that you get that right up front and that people don't start articulating the problem first. What's the first thing I do after the task appraisal, to go back to your question? I then start working with the teams, directly working with the teams, pulling out what are their ideas. Because you know what? Typically, the teams kind of know. They kind of know what the sense of the issues are. It's then important to really start to understand the different roles within problem solving. So we've kind of talked about problem types. It's then I class myself as a facilitator of change. There are three roles in any problem solving cycle. There's the role of the facilitator, there's the role of the client, and there's the role of the resource group. Right up front, you've got to get those roles really understood and nailed down. So that's probably one of the first things I do. And I work with, so the client, what's the role of the client? The client owns the problem. And by default, if the client owns the problem, they've got to have three things. Those three things are what I learned as the three eyes. Okay. And I always draw the client as an alien with three eyes. That's the interest, the influence, and the imagination. If they haven't got the interest as a client, then actually, because they've got another 20 things on their list and our thing is number 21, and it's so far down their list of priorities that actually it's not a big enough problem for them to want to solve. So you've got to establish that. It's then the influence. If they aren't the decision maker, how can they say yay or nay to a particular option or solution? That's key. You've got to get the right client. And again, if they haven't got the imagination, then actually it's just hard work. It is just hard work trying to articulate, or the resource group trying to articulate what their ideas are, because actually the client can never quite get to that point. So the third role, so I've described the facilitator and the client. The third role is the resource group, and the responsibility of the resource group is to help the client come up with those options and solutions. And my role as a facilitator is to own the process, to be able to articulate the problem and help them in the best way possible come up with the right options and the right solutions. So it's that collaboration. So I own the process of collaboration really, and bringing in the right tools at the right time to be able to do that. But I don't own the problem. And that was a big penny drop moment when I first met Andy, was I don't own the problem as a facilitator. And the moment I start owning the problem is the moment that the problem solving will start to fall apart. The reason for that is I don't have, as a facilitator, I don't have those three eyes. I don't have the interest, the influence, or the imagination to be able to solve that problem on their behalf. It's got to be the client. Client owns the problem. So then there's a difference really between collaboration and democracy. We can be very democratic within a problem-solving session, but what's important to note is the client absolutely owns the problem. And if the client absolutely owns the problem, they have the final say. And that's the line on democracy for me. Final say goes to the client. And as long as you're upfront with that, with the resource group, and you say your role is to come up with the options and solutions, but actually the client has the final say on what gets implemented. And as long as you're upfront with that, then that's fair process. And if you don't do that, then actually you'll start to have a really grumpy resource group. If you're not upfront about that and you say, well, actually, my boss has said no, even though this is the best idea, you'll start to really turn people off. And you know what? They won't want to come and help you again. So you'll get a very grumpy resource group if you go down that route.
What I was intrigued by was this notion of the client with the three eyes. And so it almost strikes me as problem number one is to get the client with you, because that all sounds fine and dandy, but my experience has been, it's not easy to go and first time you're meeting somebody inside an organization, which I think is where you're referring to in terms of your role, or if you're an advisor or somebody outside an organization, when you go in to scrub up and ask the client whether they've got the three eyes. That sounds a bit of a challenge. So I was curious what your experiences have been around reluctant clients, because don't they really want you to go and do it all? You're the advisor, the specialist, and so can't you just get on and do it?
Yeah, spot on, Andy. There's so many instances where they would call me or maybe a member of my team in, and actually they're expecting that person to put on their pants on the outside of their trousers and be Superman and save the world. And it is really tricky and I think for me it's been a real learning curve for me about holding the client to account. Real massive learning curve, and it continues. And it's a challenge every day. That's a challenge, and I can't underestimate how much of a challenge it is.
Coming up, Ant discusses obstacles to change within organisations, including guilty leadership, over-familiarity, and perhaps surprisingly, ugly babies.
Technically, you're saying that their baby is ugly. So you've got to be really careful, really, really careful.
We then turn to the nuances of Ant's role as a critical friend and coach, holding a mirror up to the client. Or as Ant describes it,
it's a little bit like having the guardrails up at the bowling alley. The client sways from left to right, and you're constantly guiding the client and you're advising them how to be good.
Stay tuned.
My only advice to anyone that's going after problem solving and trying to get a good client, how to get a good client is often something that's discussed in whatever circle I'm in. And it is about holding them to account, to be repeatable, explicit and deliberate about their role. And the moment they kind of step away from that role, it's going to sound terrible, but you're on them. You're like, no, this is your role. And this is the hardest one, actually, particularly for new people, new facilitators, new people in problem solving roles, or even people that have been doing this for a long time that haven't had this penny drop moment of not caring more than the client. Being brave enough to have that conversation of, I can't solve this problem for you. I can only solve this problem with you. And this is your responsibility, is a really challenging conversation to have. Am I successful at having those conversations all of the time? No, because every client behaves slightly differently. So your approach has got to be slightly different for each client. But at the end of the day, you can't solve that problem without them being a proper client, without them having the 3 I's present first and foremost. For me, it's a bit like going to the bowling alley, right? Very few people will get a strike every time when you go to the bowling alley. And if you get a strike every time, typically you've probably got a good client. It's a little bit like having the guardrails up at the bowling alley. The guardrails are the client, ideally you want to be dead center, but actually the client sways from left to right, and you put a guardrail up on the right, and that guardrail is you having intervention, and that might be your weekly review with them, or that might be at the end of a workshop, you're tugging on their shirt and saying, what I need you to do is this. Or at the beginning of a workshop, what I need you to do is this. And you're guiding the client and you're advising them how to be good. That's the only way I can really ever have a good client, is you're constantly helping them to be a good client and you're constantly feathering it.
Gotcha. So that's the third role that you described earlier on about being a coach and critical friend, is to kind of be that guardrail, keep nudging them back on track.
Exactly. And I think it's been open that actually, so the whole point of problem solving, having them as a client, having the resource group and me as a facilitator, is because they don't know the answer. Not only do they not know the answer, they also don't know the process of how to get to the answer. And typically they don't necessarily know how to behave. So you're there, you own the process, but you're helping them exhibit the right behaviours to get the best ideas out of the resource group. And that then we start to then talk about climate and the 9 dimensions of climate and fair process and norms, and it starts to go all into that space. But how to get a good client, really tough, really tricky. It's not a single intervention. You can't wave a magic wand at a task appraisal stage and say, this is your job, and that person will be a great client from that point onwards. It's having that guardrail up and constantly nudging the client left and right and helping them to be a good client is what I've found to be the most successful approach.
I guess you find the task appraisal starts to give you some early indications of what the size of the challenge is with helping the client to be an effective client. Yeah,
massively. Okay. And if, for instance, they were to say to me, so an early indication of interest is, how much of a priority is this for you? And sometimes I'll say on a scale of 1 to 10. If they're scoring less than a 9 or an 8, alarm bells start going off in my head. If they score it a 5 or below, I do say, you're not ready. You're not ready for me to come and work with you on this. And I will say no to working with them on it. And I'll say, I want to work with you on it, but actually you haven't got time for this at the moment. It's not the top of your priority list. Is there anything else on your priority list that actually you need help with? Because this isn't one of them. You haven't got the time to dedicate to it. So being brave, so again, going back to being brave enough to say no is a real challenge for anyone that's new to this.
So it sounds like that the role of the critical friend and coach to the client is an ongoing thing throughout the process. You can't sit them down up front and give them a lesson in this is client behaviour 101 and expect it to work.
No, exactly. They're new to this, right? They're used to people solving problems for them, putting sticking plasters on stuff for them. When you're asking them to be explicitly involved, they look at you like, what? That's what you're here for, isn't it? And actually say, no, that isn't my role here. My role, I own the process, and your role is to own the problem. By owning the problem, you've got to turn up. You've got to turn up to the sessions. You've got to set your vision out. You've got to sign off on what the guys in the resource group are saying. So you've got a massive role in all of this. And it does come as a surprise to some people. More people than not, probably 70% of people, it comes as a big surprise that I'm not going to solve the problem for them. That I'm going to solve it with them. I work with a big bank, and I was working in Leeds at the time for the same bank, and I got a phone call off the guy I was reporting to, and he said there's a team down in London, and they want you to go and have a look at this, and it was this particular process. So I went down, met with the local leader, met with the people doing the process, did a task appraisal. And after about a week of me going around just kind of figuring out what this problem really was, I turned around to the leader and I said, yeah, you've got some localized problems here and here, but actually your biggest problem is in this space. And she said, but that isn't what I asked you to look at. I said, yeah, well, no, you're right. It isn't what you asked me to look at. I said, but actually the biggest bang for your buck is if you solve this problem, all of this will go away. So you can try and solve these problems, but the root cause is over here. But even things like having a daily meeting that was short, succinct and things like that, and being the responsibility of that leader came as a big surprise. But my God, what a massive advocate she turned into. Massive advocate, because she saw the value of that holistic approach rather than looking, that's the problem. Actually, by doing the task appraisal, collecting data, really speaking to the resource group, getting their ideas, their options. They're the experts, not me. By framing that differently, getting to see a different perspective, solved a massive, massive issue. It was a really big saving for them financially, but culturally, it was a really, really big difference for them as well. Really big difference.
Does that, it's not my remit issue, come up very much? Because if you're solving a wicked problem, it's obviously going to involve more of the organisation than some people are used to dealing with.
Yeah, and that issue comes up time and time again. That one in particular, it was actually still within her remit. Although it was an offshore team, it was still technically her offshore team, so it was a little bit easier. But yeah, there are examples of where we do discover that there are problems that don't sit within the team that you're originally working with, and the problem actually originates from different teams, and that's a real challenge because you've got no relationship with the person that is the right client. You've got no relationship. So then, like, well, where'd you go there at that point? Because I haven't been employed to go and speak to that person, and you've got to be really careful that there's a term saying someone has an ugly baby. By turning around and saying there's something going on in your department, technically you're saying that their baby is ugly. So you've got to be really careful, really, really careful.
I'm trying not to laugh too much at that one. It's a good one. Yeah.
I was wondering, Ant, why do you think there is such a reluctance for folks to own up to their responsibilities with change?
There's many reasons why people are reluctant. Guilt is some of it. So if they're an established leader that's been in charge of that team for a period of time, part of it will be them feeling a little bit caught out, a little bit guilty that they didn't spot that as a problem to begin with. Some of it will be they're that familiar with their environment, the environment that they're in, that they just don't see it as an issue. They don't put their head up to look around and see the wider implications of what their department is doing or what their team is doing. They're too ingrained in looking down and working within their own team that they're not actually looking up and seeing some of the bigger issues. So that's a reluctance as well, because it then comes down to, what do you mean look up? My job isn't to look up. My job is to look down and look after my department. Forcing them to look up is a really uncomfortable thing for them to do because they're just not used to it in some instances. Some you know what? That's a casting aspersion. Some leaders are great at that. The majority aren't, is what I find.
The sense I was wondering was, is it just education? They haven't been taught this stuff, or looking down, is it the focus of management thinking and team problems? I was curious.
I think it is the link back to learning, and some people want to learn, other people don't want to learn. Learning can be uncomfortable because it forces you to reflect on how you're currently performing. If you don't do that, actually, what are you learning for? It's uncomfortable. It's an uncomfortable thing for them to do. It definitely links back to learning. I think it links back to education, training, but it's a wider issue, I think, in some instances of the traditional manager. What does the traditional manager do? The traditional manager focuses blinkered on their department. Anything other than that isn't their job. And it's the transition from being that traditional manager to actually being that more inclusive leader. So all of those different things combined make it really, and there's many more. So there's many more reasons why leaders don't want to show up and be an exemplary client. I think some of it is, in my opinion and my experience, is if they're an established leader, some of them just don't want to face up to reality because it means that actually they failed at some point in the past or failed to act at some point in the past. 9 times out of 10, I do generally find it much easier to work with a manager that is new in post because they are much more open to new things in the first instance, but they're also not tied down emotionally or so from a guilt point of view to not changing things in the past.
Interesting. The language you're bringing in is intriguing, that things like guilt and shame. There's a writer around at the moment who's being very popular called Brené Brown, and she talks about in making ourselves vulnerable in order to lead change in today's world. And it sounds like what you're talking about. It's kind of, we could almost try and figure out which people are prepared to make themselves vulnerable and open to learn. Would be if we could have some kind of litmus test to check that out, right? When we're doing the task appraisal, it would be really helpful. Which leads me to, you said something right a long time ago. You talked about a project. You talked about her being a good leader.
Yeah.
So what was it that made her a good leader in your mind?
Lots of different things. But if you were to tie it down to one or two, she was very good at creating a climate for us as a team to thrive. So she was very good at creating that high performance climate. And did she do that by not having rules and allowing us to do whatever we wanted to do? Absolutely not. We actually had some really strong norms, what I know them as norms. Some people call them teamship rules, whatever you want to call them. We had some really strong norms that we'd mapped out, and we had them on the wall. That's how we are going to interact with each other, and that's how we're going to interact with the business. So first and foremost, norms. Then it's about setting that vision. We did lots of work on values, purpose, vision, goals. So actually we all knew why we were turning up to work every day. We knew why we were turning up, and we knew what we were trying to achieve. They were really clear. And as a result of those two things and setting that climate, we had a really high performing team. And we were running some really, really successful projects as a result. Because you know what? We knew that we had her as a leader to back us up. So if we were having some sticky moments with a particular project, a particular client, stuff like that, and actually she would help us, she would back us up, and she would move mountains for us. So she had our back as well. So all of those different things combined, she was just a really, really good leader, really good leader.
There's a question I do want to ask you, and if with the benefit of hindsight now, I think you said 20 years of business improvement work. If you were to look back at all the projects that you've been involved in and put them in two piles, one pile which were all the projects that you met the needs, client was happy, job done, problem solved, and then you had another pile which were, it kind of didn't really make it, fizzled out, a bit of a nightmare. I want to erase that from my memory, that sort of thing. What do you think accounted for the difference? What would be the top three things that you would think accounted for why they ended up in the first pile as opposed to the second pile? The first pile being the success and the second one being the less successful or ineffective.
So my first answer to that, so you said I've got three things. Okay, so my first one is one. Okay, although I'm going to say but it is one, because it's about the leadership being explicit, deliberate, and being an advocate. And by that I mean being involved. Okay, and by being involved, they're explicitly involved, they're deliberately involved, and when they are involved, they're an advocate of what the collective is trying to do. So that leadership behaviour is number one, front and centre. Number two for me, that distinguishes between the most successful and the least successful. Number two is a burning platform. And that goes right the way back to, you've got to have a problem to solve. If you haven't got a problem to solve, or it's actually no one really cares about it, or there isn't really any consequences to it, then actually it's going to fizzle out, because something else is going to come along and trump it. A gust of wind will blow it away. It won't take much. And the third thing, and this third thing is probably only in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, is about care. And the leader, the client, has got to care. And I can't care more than the client.
The notion of care to me is to suffer for, my understanding. The origin, the etymology, the root of the word care means to suffer for. So you're talking about here is like the leader suffers for, goes into that space that we talked about earlier on, where you feel maybe guilt or shame or vulnerable or uncertain, all those, and how that makes you feel. That is caring for. You suffer those things on behalf of the overall problem space that you're trying to address, the gap you're trying to close. It's kind of how I'm seeing that.
No, I think that's right, and I think it's caring. So there's that side of things. So there's the things that could weigh you down, and having those, you've got to care. But then there's caring in terms of what am I trying to, what is it we're trying to achieve, and caring enough to motivate people to push it over the line. KPIs always spring to mind for me, and measuring the success of that project. And actually, if the client and the leader doesn't care enough about the performance, why should you care about the performance as the facilitator? Why should the resource group care about coming up with options and solutions if you don't care as a leader? So for me, it is, I've categorized it as number three. But actually, they're all tying for first place. Depends on which hat you're wearing, but naturally they come out in that order for me, depending on which hat you're wearing at the time. So they're all tying for first place in reality.
Where do you get the energy from to keep going? What do you draw on?
I suppose I am a believer in kind of that greater good, and you've got to have thick skin, right, to be in this game. I think that thick skin comes from that belief of kind of the greater good. So I'll take a few knocks, and people saying, "Not today," I'm trying to be that coach and hold the mirror up. The energy comes from working with people. I remember this one lady. She said to me, I often ask this question: if you had a magic wand, what's the one thing you would change about the things that you do? And it was a lady that was working in a different type of bank, and she said to me, interruptions. She almost had, and I'm not exaggerating, she almost had tears in her eyes. She said, we constantly interrupted, and what that means is my quality standard goes down, because I'm working on something and the phone will go, or I'll have a tap on the shoulder or something like that, and my quality rate goes down, which then means that I can get put on a performance plan. So if anything, please just stop the interruptions. And we did a fantastic piece of work with them. And the engagement of that team, but that lady in particular, was massive. And we did manage to stop the interruptions. There's various things I could go into of how we did that, but we stopped her being interrupted. And the sense of control that she then had over her day, she was actually smiling, and she said thank you because of that one intervention. So that's one that sticks firmly in my mind, but there's hundreds of them. And I think actually my role is to make things easier for people, processes easier for people. And that's what keeps me going. That's where I get my energy from, because it's quite neat, isn't it? That you're able to help people in a different kind of way.
Yeah, sometimes a bit of ironic though, isn't it? That the word facilitate means to help and make easy. But sometimes to do that, we have to go into a dark place or almost to reduce their performance or their sense of capability for a while in order to come out the other side in a better place. So
yeah,
which is one of the paradoxes I often find.
Yeah, there's I don't know the proper name for it, but I refer to it sometimes as the pit of learning. And they'll go into that. So their performance is up here just as you turn up, and then they'll go down and then you'll kind of hold the mirror up, and they'll reflect, and they'll actually, it won't be working for them, and it'll feel uncomfortable, but then they'll come out the other side of that and the performance will be much higher. So it's kind of, they'll go down into that pit and then back up again. There is a technical name for that study, but I'm not sure what it is.
Yeah, it's a lot of people stand on the edge of that pit as well, don't they? And think, because the deeper you go into the pit, the higher you fly out the other side. It's like a slingshot effect. And quite often I find that people get to the edge of the pit there and think, no thanks.
Run off.
You call yourself a business improvement leader, and you probably know there's sort of different flavors of change, improvement or developmental type change at one end of the spectrum, and the other end you could call a leap or exploratory type change. So do you find any challenges or difference in the language of how you approach that whole space?
There's a question, right? And it's actually a question only you introduced me to. It's what newness do you think you want? And for me, and I kind of phrase it then, do you want evolution or revolution? And often people will say revolution. I want something totally different. This isn't working for me. And then when they're faced with the reality of that change, it kind of scares them a little bit. And they're like, actually, can we just have a little bit of evolution instead, please? So it favours the brave a little bit, revolution, I think. And evolution is for the people that aren't necessarily quite so brave. So there's a big difference.
I kind of feel like we've explored some great space, and so I'm going to say thank you right now.
But before you go, Ant, we're going to end with 3 standard questions that are designed to reveal a bit more about you personally. If you could please give an answer and briefly explain the reasoning for your answer. First question, follow the rules or break the rules?
It's almost like a politician's answer for this one. So I'm certainly one that bends the rules and pushes the boundaries of rules, breaking the rules if really deemed necessary. And I have been in situations where I have broken the rules, if you like, on a few occasions, because actually the rules are nonsensical in some situations. So I'm definitely more break the rules than follow the rules.
I love that. Pushes the boundaries of the rules.
Yeah,
they're never black and white.
They're not. They're there to be pushed. Rules are there to be pushed. I never tell my kids that.
Okay. So next question, talk it through with other people or think it through on your own?
I've got a 2-pronged approach, which typically works for me, where generally I'll think it through myself first in terms of I'll put a straw man together in some way, shape or form. I'll then offer that to trusted people or the resource group, and I'll let them kick that around and the idea will develop from that point. But the initial thoughts, I always find it easier if I've just got that time to process myself, get it down on some paper, and then let other people kick that around. As long as you're open to that kind of thing, then that works for me.
So a bit of both.
A bit of both.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Good. Okay, last question. Trust your head or follow your heart?
I am often described as wearing my heart on my sleeve. I think I do follow my heart, my gut feel, my instinct a lot. There is a data side of me that then says follow the data later. So go for the head stuff later, prove it later. So I'll definitely go for the heart first and then the head later.
Okay, hunch first and then look to back it up with some data.
Yeah, and there's a Six Sigma saying, in God we trust, everyone else must bring data. And I do I can get that, I can recognise that. But for me, gut feel, hunch, there's a lot to be said for it. And as long as you're experienced enough in that field to have a good gut feel and hunch, then I think that's where you should follow first. Excellent. Otherwise you procrastinate, I think. You procrastinate and you don't get anything done.
Yes, true. Well, thank you very much for those answers.
Yeah, I wrote down follow the data later as sounds like a kind of mantra or something that could go on a tweet or a website or an advertising slogan. Follow the data later, alligator. Thank you very much for being with us today. Absolutely fabulous. Honestly, I thank you so much.
Thanks, Ant, and nice to see
you. No worries.
Thanks, Ant. Cheers.
Guys, thank you. Bye.
This podcast was brought to you by Perspectiv in collaboration with the Centre for Creativity in Professional Practice at the Business School, formerly known as CAS. You can follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn or visit us at perspectiv.co.uk, Perspectiv with no E. Thank you for listening and please join us again.